Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Freight Gong Friday. We got two very special guests with us today. We got a lot of conversation that we're going to probably have around some carrier sales, but super happy to have Mark Ford with us. Mark is the COO at Blue Grace. Thanks, Mark, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And we got Will Jenkins, who many of you know started a company as well called Journey. He's the founder and CEO of Journey. I'll let you give the introduction.
Yep, we do recruiting, consulting, and training for brokerages. Been in the space the last 11 years. Had an opportunity to help build and co-found Molo. So fun times.
Cool. So the interesting piece here is that both of you guys worked at Coyote, and I would love to hear the early days, or as early as they can be remembered, what that was like. Particularly, obviously, Coyote is a very big company. It's sold to UPS for billions of dollars, and recently it's traded hands over to RXO. So that's been in the news. Obviously, Mark, we talked a little bit about trying to get you on earlier, but given all of the natural disaster occurrences that have been happening, this has been kind of getting postponed. So I'm glad that we're able to finally get you on and kind of hear about your time there. It's just maybe how many years ago was this?
So we started Coyote back in 2006.
And you were there from if I remember correctly, like basically a few months after that company got officially when you guys got authorized, you were already there at the company, right?
That is correct. Yeah, the company was started. Not a lot of people know this. It was called Coyote Logistics Systems. So it was going to be a SaaS product. And I think a few months into it, Jeff decided he wanted to flip it around and turn it back into a freight brokerage because, that's probably at that time what he knew best. And that's when, we got in touch, and I was employee number one on the brokerage side. So you had, I think, 4 people on the development team. You had Jeff, obviously. Marianne was going to do the recruiting. We had someone building kind of like the training manuals for the SaaS product, which we flipped around and kind of made that the training manuals for our new employees when we started bringing them in. But yeah, when I started, we didn't even have our operating authority. So I think I started on like August 8th of 2006. And Jeff kind of said, well, hey, we'll probably get our authority towards the end of the month in August. And so we were just testing the system out, entering carriers, just trying to break things. And it wasn't a functional system at that point in time. And so, less than a week later, I think it was on August 14th or so, we actually got our authority. And, I heard Jeff yell down the hall, Ford, we got our authority. And, 5 minutes later, he's like, Ford, we got our first load. So
let's go.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it was Conyers, Georgia, and North Lake, Illinois. And it took me one call to book it because I had carriers that actually ran that lane. So I just, I called the first one. It was Pegasus out of Clarksville, Indiana, and booked it up. And then we're like, all right, let's just do this. But at that point in time, we didn't have a way to send a rate confirmation from the system in and of itself. So I built a template out of Excel, and, we just, manufactured a rate confirmation, stuck it on the wall, and then just moved it across. And that's just kind of the early days before the system was ready. For the first couple of weeks, we just had these sheets of paper that we would send the sheet of paper through a fax machine or
wild.
I was about to ask because this is 2006, right? So like maybe it sounds like a stupid question now, but in 2006, were carriers actually using email? Like was it pretty largely?
Yeah, they were using email. So but we still had to have a way to get it into our system. So sometimes we would just save it as an Excel file. Sometimes we would print it out or do whatever to send the rate confirmation out. But yeah, it was definitely not the tech behemoth that it ended up becoming at that point in time. So it was well along the way. They already had the foundational pieces built out, but it just wasn't functional in the first days because we just got our authority so much quicker than we thought we were going to get it. So that's really kind of how we started things off. And it was just Jeff and myself in this little room, and Then we went out and hired, Dave Herbert, which, Will knows obviously very well. I think you worked with the team, right, Will?
Totally. So when I started January of 2014, Dave was one of the first people I met along with Drew. So I met both of them in the den for lunch, and actually sent not Herbert, but Herpick a message the other day. It was like, man, that first day, you telling me people to go meet and questions to ask changed the trajectory of my career, because I met so many good people that were great at what they did. And so it's like, man, if they can do it, like, let me just learn what I can from them. But those two, incredible.
Will, did you ever send a Raycon over a fax machine?
You know what? I did, but it was through the system. So 8 years later, we could click a button and it would fax it through the TMS, which is pretty sweet.
So that TMS was called Bazooka, and that through Bazooka they had it wired up somehow to a fax machine that would automate faxes.
Yeah.
It's pretty. I never used the fax machine personally, so even though I would say I was growing up during the time where they were still popular, but was never obviously in professional life yet. So I literally just had no idea that that's how it worked. But how many carriers still use? How many companies, period, still use fax machines? I mean, I would imagine probably not many, but is it some? Do some shippers still require it? Like maybe some antique infrastructure or something?
Not that I know of.
Everybody's off of it at this point, so thankfully. That's cool. Cool. So, Will, remind me, when did you get to Coyote?
I started at Coyote in January of 2014. So it was about a year and a half after I graduated college. I had another role for a bit, and then I had a few friends that were sales reps at Coyote. And when I was looking for a new job, they were like, we're doing well here, money's good. I was like, sweet, I don't know much about freight, but sounds like y'all are having a good time. And so I went and interviewed and was like, this place is sick. I want to be here. So that was January 2014 when I started.
And you were there for how long? Were you there all the way through the UPS acquisition?
I started, so I was there for 3 years, and they were acquired August of 15. So it was, I hadn't been there too long, right? I got a chance to kind of see what that whole process was like. It was really cool because there were a ton of people during that time that were like coming through the office, and you get to answer some questions and you're clicking around in the TMS, showing them how the stuff works. So it was pretty sweet to work through that, but I wasn't there super long prior to that.
So not everybody gets the chance to obviously sit and work at a very fast, large growing company that sells for billions of dollars in this business. What we can kind of go between the two of you, but out of the companies that you've been at, and I guess both of you have been at now both multiple big enterprises here. What are like the consistent themes that you have seen really differentiate what makes a company actually big and grow big versus the ones that end up growing to a certain point and then kind of not being able to get beyond, a certain cross a certain chasm, basically. Maybe it's particularly on, let's kind of keep it to like the, let's say, carrier sales side of things for the time being, because it's obviously a very important part of the piece of the equation for brokerages. But Mark, maybe you can go first.
Sure. I think, it starts with hiring the right people. I think when you look back at even the backhauler days, because I started off in American Backhauler, so I worked with Jeff and Marianne, at an entity before, we had a chance to start Coyote. And you just look at just the people in general. And Marianne was, she's the GOAT when it comes to identifying the right people, building the recruiting engine. You had a whole team of people that she ended up training. Like, I couldn't do that job. And I've said that to basically every single recruiting department that I've ever been involved with. Like, I just don't, that's just not a skill set that I have. But, going out and finding those people, because if you look at the people that I had on my team, Will already mentioned Drew Herpick, he's over at Nolan, and Jayann, Tio, who's down, over at Arrive, and Chappis is at Uber, and Sean Fahey over at Capstone, and Frisco, he's at Rapido.
Crazy talent.
Crazy, man. I had some I had some studs on my team. And it's like, if you give people the right opportunity and you hire the right people, I mean, they just take it by the horns, and that's just really kind of what happened. I mean, you had Joe Rodemaker and Billy come through you guys, and, you know, Herbert's still with the RXO Coyote thing, and, you know, Soskin and Goodship. Like, you just look at all these people that, you know, that came through the organization, and it wasn't really about like anything that, you know, we all did individually. It's something that you have this team of people, and if you give them the right opportunity and you give them the right type of like just a focus, and hey, this is what we're going to do. The early years at Coyote, like, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for all of these guys that had, you know, they started out, you know, Herpik was one of the first training classes that we had. And there wasn't a lot of opportunity for these guys to make money early. And you're a new company that nobody's ever heard of. And you're selling sort of a dream. And at some point, like, you know, you have to actually come through on your side of the equation. And, but they all, you know, I don't know if today's type of, you know, college grad is going to have that much patience in building something that we just were afforded back then. But, you know, lucky enough for us, we, you know, had the right people that came in, and we gave them the opportunity, and they all crushed it. And they've all gone on to do bigger things than what they did when they were with us at Coyote, which is really cool to see.
Will, you're on the recruiting side of things. Are you helping recruit any carrier sales reps, or is this more so like customer sales reps?
Yeah, we recruit everything. There are opportunities today with clients that we're helping to find really strong carrier sellers, you know, particular dynamics in terms of what you look for, depending on the size and complexity of your carrier sales team. But back to what Ford mentioned in terms of what it takes to grow that team fast, the first thing is by far and away talent, right? You need to hire a fit, and it doesn't necessarily matter if you have a role for that talent. So all the people that Mark mentioned either own a business today, or they are high-powered execs leading on a different side of the business than they started on, right? Jayanne was my training manager after training. So I went through training with Alicia Clockey. It was the last training class she did, and I love Alicia. She's incredible, doing her thing at Mastery now. And then I went to Jayanne, who was the hot pot manager, and she taught me the game in and out. And now she's CSO, I believe, at Arrive. Just absolutely stellar levels of talent. And we could go through 100+ people who have the same pedigree, but they were hungry and ambitious and willing to learn and really soaked in everything the business had to offer. But another thing I think is interesting is the standard. So the standard of excellence was the standard. And if you weren't willing to do that, there's not a place for you, especially in an organization that's going to move that quickly and grow to that size. And you have to recruit to that standard and train to that standard and coach to that standard. And you either rise up to it, or this isn't going to work for you. And if you want to be a company that grows that quickly, especially with an engine that executes freight like the carrier sales side, there's a standard. And if you can't keep up with it, it's not going to work for you. And I saw that firsthand. I was like, I love this, because you have to be able to be willing to do that work. And it was refreshing.
What happens if you, like, let's say, hire the wrong person that doesn't meet that standard, and maybe you got to let them go, but you're still trying to grow super fast as a company? Like, obviously there's that lag time between somebody coming in and you determining, like, okay, you're not going to be able to meet these standards, and this isn't going to be a fit. How do you keep the gaps filled in terms of making sure things are still moving fast?
I think there's something special when the vision is in place. And so Ford mentioned selling this vision to the team, and you're doing the same thing externally to carriers and customers. We're gonna be this behemoth organization where we're gonna do all this stuff. If you can do that and get your people excited about what you're building, bro, I'm going to stay to cover the loads. Like, okay, cool. Like, I know where we're going. Cool. I'll be here early. Like, listen, we onboarded this new contract. Like, we got to cover the freight. I just think there's a necessary passion you have to have from leaders to paint a picture to get people bought in, because the ups and downs are crazy. And Ford, like, my first year on the carrier floor I got done with training March of 2014, and we had like a real produce season, like an actual one, where there was seasonality. And I'm like, this is bananas. but there was so much commitment to get it done. I'm like, all right, bro, if this is what we have to do, this is what we have to do. So I think there's something to be said about creating that level of intensity that gets people bought in when there's the ups and downs.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree any more than from what you said, because I mean, you know, when we did first start the company, we were all doing, you know, you're all hands on deck. You're working weekends. I mean, I think for the first 5 years I was there, I think I probably worked every weekend, but maybe, I don't know, a handful, right? And so, you know, and when you're doing it as a leader, your other people are just like, well, I'm going to come in to help too. I don't want you to be the only person that's sitting there doing it. And you know, when we got that opportunity, you know, and Will, you know, I'm not going to say the customer, but we got an opportunity to do something really special. And we literally built, you know, probably a massive part of that company around it. You know, we were the ones that executed. We were the small fish. I mean, we were the small fish in this big pond, and all these larger companies actually had the opportunity. But we were preaching, hey, all it takes is one customer for us to really change the trajectory of this company. And we got it. And, you know, it was just like, it was a crazy weekend. It was the weekend before 4th of July. They offered us like 100 and something shipments, and nobody else would take them, you know, because it's usually the busiest weekend of the year is that weekend before the 4th of July, the stock up time. And, you know, we just said, take them all. We're going to get this done. And I think I had like maybe 40 people on my team at that time. It wasn't a large team, but we got probably 75% of the people in on Saturday and Sunday. We covered every single shipment that they had. I think the last one left the dock at like 9 o'clock in the morning when they came in, and they just called us up and they're like, how did they expected us? Like, okay, they'll probably get 25% of these, 30% of these things out, and it's gonna be better than nothing. And we executed on everything. And
how do you do that?
We had good people, and we had a process. You know, I think when you talk about carrier sales in general, like nothing has changed in carrier sales in the 28 years I've been doing this. If you prioritize a carrier, they prioritize you. And so we always went into our sales calls with the, you know, intent of, hey, I'm not trying to be, this isn't a transaction. This is an interaction. I'm going to try to figure out how I can help this carrier out. And when the carriers feel like you're prioritizing them, and we were calling them constantly, we were getting information from them. And, you know, we had a database of good information to go off of. And, you know, you plow through it. I mean, you figure out a way, you know, to get things done. I mean, it's no different, you know, but if you prioritize a carrier, they prioritize you. We had already built some relationships up with carriers early on. And you know, so I think we had a lot of trust, and we had a history of, you know, carriers have always been my customers the entire time I've been in this industry. So, you know, we had a good foundation to start from. And, you know, we just kind of, you know, you just make it work, you make it happen.
Yeah. So in this crisis moment, you leverage these relationships that you have with these carriers. Mm-hmm. And basically, even if you have a stellar team, everybody's just picking up the phones, calling whoever they can, and trying to ask them like, hey, can you rearrange whatever loads maybe you booked or something? Because I mean, at the last second, I would imagine, you know, most trucking companies probably are booked to some extent, right? So you're asked, you know, those relationships basically come in really handy, because the carriers will somehow figure out like, all right, I want to preserve this relationship, I'm going to move some stuff around. Is that kind of more or less how it happens? Everybody's just picking up the phone, calling everybody and seeing.
Yeah. For more, I mean, you know, these loads in general, you know, price wasn't an issue. It was a matter of, hey, they're going to be out of stock. Like so when price isn't an issue, it makes it a little bit easier.
Right? I've always heard there's no bad loads, just bad rates.
No bad loads, just bad money and loads, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, our database was good, and you know,
so good.
Yeah. And so we had, you know, our system by that time was already, you know, full blown, you know, just a legitimate, probably the best TMS on the market at that point in time. And, you know, we just had good data. We had people that just didn't want to let this opportunity slip away from them. That team was going to do whatever it took. Those individuals were going to do whatever it took, because they knew if they executed, it was going to look good for us, which was just going to make their lives easier. And, you know, It's some of the same people that I mentioned earlier, were in that room that weekend, you know, making that happen.
There's another interesting piece to it also, which is, you know, the desire and passion, the willingness to do the work, but also being able to use the information to do the work more effectively is really important. And one thing I've seen now, leaving an organization like Coyote that had incredible technology to allow carrier sales reps to do their jobs well, you might have that same level of dedication someplace else, but if it's really hard to go and find the information and rationalize it and use it to make the right calls, it's tough to continue to get the buy-in, because you can beat your head on the wall for as long as you want, but like, shoot, the information's hard to get and use. It's really hard to make coverage effective.
So that information kind of accumulated through the operation of Coyote, I assume, right? Like, it didn't just kind of exist on day 0 or on day 1 when it happened. It was just over time, as the internal Bazooka system just started getting used and more loads started getting booked. It was the way that people were entering that information, how that information was being stored and then accessible to the rest of the organization. That's what made that difference, I assume, right?
Yeah, I mean, Will can contest to this. I mean, I think when people start off in the position and we tell them, hey, look, it's not about chasing freight. It's about building your portfolio of carriers that you're going to deal with. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't make sense. The amount of phone calls that we require people to make, the amount of, you know, trucks that we actually, you know, enforce them to post, and all the metric driven stuff that, you know, sometimes maybe on the front end of the cycle doesn't seem like it makes a lot of, you know, sense, or, you know, it's maybe not the best use of your time, but that information becomes gold as you start to expand. And like Will said, when you're running a search, or, you know, you can build an algorithm that just puts the data in front of somebody instead of them having to, you know, search through 50 screens or pull up 8 different, you know, external platforms to try to find carriers to call. That was huge. I mean, it's a game changer. It really is. It's the difference between, you know, getting a hold or getting access of that truck or not getting access to that truck because it's gone 5 minutes later. If you have access to it before somebody else does, you're going to win most of the time.
Totally.
I've never built a portfolio of carriers, so I was always on the carrier side. But how would you define a good portfolio versus a bad portfolio?
Ooh.
Well, I mean, it's all about the organization in of itself is going to kind of determine. So if you have a lot of, say, dry van freight, but you're just going after refrigerated carriers, you're probably not going to have a great portfolio. But you also you can there's a method when you start calling carriers. If you call them 3 days in a row, it's just kind of like a science. Actually, first of all, if you have information on them, like if you know what color their trucks are, you know what their logo is, you know where you've seen that truck. You know, my wife and kids got sick of every time we went on a road trip writing down MC numbers and the location of where we saw them. And so I actually have a GoPro camera that I use now that I stick on the front, you know, and so you see it and we take pictures of it and we put it in the carrier files, because when someone's making a cold call, if you have some information on that carrier, they love to talk about their trucks. They love to talk about their logo, the color, why they chose it, why they were in a specific location at a specific time. They know that you're actually calling for something other than, hey, do you have a truck here to help me on this? They realize that you actually want to know more about their company. And so they open up. Certain carriers won't. Certain carriers won't open up with me. They may open up with Will. Certain carriers, you know, may open up, you know, or you know, better with you than me. And, you know, you kind of figure it out. But the method of calling a carrier one day, getting a certain amount of information, you don't want to keep them on the phone too long. They're busy. So if you can limit that first call to 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, extract a certain amount of information from them. Usually you have a transaction or a lane in mind that you're calling about. And then the next day you follow up. You just follow up with that carrier. Hey, you know what? These are the loads that I've got in that lane or whatever in the past. Would these work for you? You're pre-selling that, you know, for the future. And you have a benchmark of where you're currently sitting at versus what works for them. And they'll tell you off the top of the head, yeah, that works. That doesn't work. This is where I get stuff. And then they start opening up to you because you literally called them back with information that they gave you that they may need help with. And now you're making them a priority. You're prioritizing that. You're not really calling them for a transaction. You're calling them because you're trying to help them, fill their network up. And from that point in time, you just know, like, for me, I did a lot of Midwest going to the East Coast. That's how I built a lot of my portfolio out early on when I was at American Backhaulers. And, for me, the important thing was if they got trucks in Chicago, I was like, great. It's a difficult sell to go from Chicago to the East Coast, especially back then. When we first started, it was just hard to find those trucks. And so if you just pound the phones and you're just asking specific pointed questions, hey, do you get trucks in Chicago? Do you get trucks in Memphis? Some of the, more industrialized areas. And then you kind of go from the opportunities that your customers give you. I mean, most of the time it's going to be a difficult one. I mean, I remember early on when we started getting loads originally from, this large customer, and, Jeff's whole philosophy was just give us the hardest to cover freight, and for whatever rate you want to give us. And I was looking at him like he was crazy. I'm like, what are you doing? There's no way we're going to make money that way. But you build up street cred from that customer, because you're literally like, okay, well, I'm covering something from, the middle of northern Utah to, Montana. And you're just...
I remember booking like just the craziest loads from like Bangor, Maine to like Kentucky. I'm like, this is the worst load I've ever seen in my life. Just the worst load, but it makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
I know from running a carrier, no drivers want to go out to the East Coast. Like going into New York is like the worst thing that you could possibly ask them to do, or anywhere in a super dense city, on the East Coast. So obviously, I mean, that's why rates probably always towards that side of the country are much higher.
I wanted to toss out one thing about building a carrier portfolio. I learned this from an OG my first like month or so on the floor. I sat next to Zach Canole, who was incredible, like a high performing refrigerated carrier seller. My desk was right next to his, and I was like, man, I'm out of hot pod. I've got 1 or 2 owner ops I'm booking. Like, let's do this thing. And it was like, look, man, our team manages inbound Southeast refrigerated freight. So what you need to do is have relationships in every major hub that our team has some sort of responsibility over. So we start looking at the map, and he's like, you need a Miami carrier, you need an Orlando carrier, you need a Jacksonville carrier, you need Savannah, you need Atlanta. We start going through all these major metros. He's like, every call you make every day, document it, log those trucks, know what's going on, and then keep doing that every day until you tag those carriers. You've booked enough freight with them. And now as soon as you see particular loads, it doesn't really matter, right? You know who your inbound Atlanta carrier is. You know who your inbound Savannah carrier is. And that framework in the beginning changed my whole career, because all I thought about was how do I become the guy that's got trucks that need this freight? And all I'm trying to do is develop those relationships. And it took months. It was a much longer process. I'm not trying to do this transaction. I want to do this long term. But it's the same as trying to build a customer portfolio. Like, I need to figure out how to serve them and what they need. I got to ask the right kind of questions. And you got to think about it long term.
Interesting. So that's a great overview from a portfolio perspective. That's like I said, I never was on the broker side of things. So these are all super interesting learning lessons, even for me, but hopefully even for the audience too. Anything else? I guess one of my questions was like on the Bazooka side of things. What did it look like in terms of entering in? Like what was its most powerful aspect? Was it sourcing? Bazooka was mainly. Can you guys describe real quick like what Bazooka really stood out for? Was it just sourcing the capacity? Was it all encompassing, understanding like what loads were needing to be booked, how you can fill them with the relationships that you guys had? You guys got into it a little bit, but I never saw what Bazooka looked like, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it was a full functional TMS, and it mostly was, I think when you look at it in general, you would say from a truckload perspective, that's what it really specialized in. And it was all aspects of it. I mean, we had a customer file, so you could store rates in a customer. You could store all kinds of information, historical billing, everything that you had to, learn about a customer. You even had a functional CRM that was built into it at one point. And on, the carrier side, it was the same thing. I mean, it was, you were able to log a bunch of information into it that it was just accessible so that if anyone pulled up that file, you could see a whole bunch of data in there that you wouldn't have to call to source again. And then we had load boards. I mean, like, the fortunate thing that I actually had with Coyote was I had a design. So early on, I realized the importance of a carrier relationship at American Backhaulers. And then when CH bought American Backhaulers, I also realized that there was some sort of geographical advantage of having, some sort of a system based on geographical. I thought the CH model was backwards. I mean, if I was a carrier that had trucks in Buffalo and Chicago, I would call the Buffalo office for that truck, and I'd call a Chicago office for my Chicago trucks. And so I kind of flipped the script and said, hey, I'm going to design these carrier teams in backhaul geographical regions. And, we spiced it up a little bit because we hired a lot of athletes and a lot of people that went to big universities that followed football. So we called them all, named them all after the conferences. So we had Big Ten and we had the SEC and we had all these kind of, cool things, and they had banners and stuff. And it was just a really cool atmosphere in and of itself. But the way the load board was organized and the way that the managers, they were responsible for their geographical region. And there was a lot of cross coverage going on. There was a lot of, cooperation that happened between the teams, helping each other out and all that, because, even if you had carriers that generally speaking go back to the Southeast, you also had carriers that were based in the Southeast that you may need outbound help because, you had a carrier fall off a shipment or whatever. So there was a lot of, but the actual visibility that we had, because we had offices all over the place, and it didn't matter if the customer rep was in Portland or Denver or Detroit or whatever it was, they would put their load on the board and it was visible like a stock exchange. You just saw everything that, was in there, and then it automatically matched to your posted trucks and displayed that for you. So you didn't have to go figure out, oh, is Racine, Wisconsin really close to Chicago? Like, it actually did the math for you and said, there it is. It's 64 miles away or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, it was a really cool from a visibility standpoint. Like, we called ourselves a centralized carrier sales team because we had basically a centralized, goal, and we, as a team, we were not all sitting in the same place, but we all saw the same thing. Right. And so we just considered ourselves, because we were a shared service there, and much like we are here. And so, yeah, I think it was from a visibility standpoint, from an information standpoint, from just like a load matching. I know a lot of software platforms even today don't have that, which is just like bananas. Like how, when you've been in the industry long enough, that Florence, Kentucky and Cincinnati are only like 11 or 12 miles away from each other. But the new person doesn't know that. And our system kind of took a lot of that guessing game away from it and just gave the information to the people so they didn't have to sort through all that. They could act fast. They could work fast.
Will, what's your thoughts on this topic around building custom software in-house at a brokerage versus using off the shelf?
I think most companies should never do it, because if you're a freight brokerage, you need to be working on figuring out how to make your freight profitable, and margins are slim enough as is, and engineers are expensive. And so unless you're a tech company that sells that and you can benefit from tech-style margins, it's just too costly to try to do it. Now, if you want to have people create like a bolt-on or an external portal, but the lift it takes to create a proprietary TMS for most sub $200 million brokerages, the reward is just not there. Now, once you start busting out the seams of your off-the-shelf TMS and you've made enough money to invest in a team to build it, and you see the long-term vision, it can make sense. But most companies should never try to build their own TMS, in my honest opinion.
Mark, why did this work then for Coyote? Because that's effectively what they did, right? It was entirely proprietary and in-house.
Yeah, you got to remember though, at American Backhaulers, Jeff designed the software platforms that CH ended up buying. So you see the benefit of, hey, if you do build it properly and you know how to build it properly and you have the right team of people that can build it, there is a lot of financial benefit potentially down the road, because it is a differentiator, and you can make and get a better valuation if you do have good tech. But like Will said, I mean, if you're not that if you're just, if you're a good sales rep that wants to go on your own and you just don't understand the nuances of building tech, get one of the off-the-shelf platforms, on your first iteration, and then you could always go from there when you can invest in the time, or you have people that come that cross paths with you that you feel comfortable and confident that they can build it out. But it is a massive amount of task to do that, and a lot of work to keep it going. But then again, you also don't have to wait for somebody else if you want to make a change or something like that. You have a lot more control doing it that way. So, but there's just like when we talk about a pod structure versus a split model. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer for it. You could build a successful company doing it either way. And sometimes the pod structure makes sense for certain organizations based on the type of freight. If you have more specialized type of freight, a pod structure actually is probably more beneficial for you, because you just have so many unique characteristics of that shipment that can go wrong. It's better to be closer to the source of where the information came from. But if you're traditionally more of a dry van type of company that's going after Fortune 5,000 accounts, it probably makes a little bit more sense to split that out and have somebody that's more focused on building up the capacity, because you're going to have a lot of consistent volumes, probably lower margin, and you're just going to have to, what Will's saying, I have my guy in Savannah, you're going to need 5 guys in Savannah, 5 guys in Atlanta. And you start building up your lanes. You always want to have, as a carrier rep, you always want to have more than one option, right? Because when you jump in that shipment, you're like, I need to have 5 or 6 guys that do this. I want to become the guy that runs this. But yeah, I think that's, from a standpoint of tech, it's just, it makes sense for some. It doesn't make sense for others. And just like, just how people are structured internally, there's no right or wrong answer.
Yeah. I don't think most people maybe realize, like Jeff Silver's background is technical, and I believe maybe his master's was at MIT, or I'm not sure if his undergrad was, but he definitely has a technical background. And I think, when I look at the reasoning around approaching whether or not you're building in proprietary tech, like, you probably should have a technical background, a deep technical background.
Yeah, and you got to remember that the tech was already probably about 70% there, at least from the starting point, for us to be able to do transactions and to scale it, for the first few years. It wasn't like we were starting from ground zero and trying to move freight at the same time. There was already a team that was building out the tech, and the tech was already going to be there. It only took us 2 or 3 weeks before we could enter shipments and send them out through the system and all that stuff. So that was a big reason why we went that direction as well. So
as both of you are kind of watching the landscape of how things have been for the last decade or so, Mark, you mentioned you've been in the business almost 28 years. What are some of the things that you see taking place in terms of changes, like where things actually are going in terms of carrier sales? Is there, I think we maybe are all seeing some things online on social media. We at Freight Caviar post about it a little bit, some new technology. Where are you guys seeing kind of things trend, and what should people be aware about? Will, maybe we'll go with you first.
So I don't think carrier sales has changed much since I started in January of 2014. And the reason I say that is, when I started in 2014, we were sending loads to carriers with no human intervention on a routing guide. And now there are business models built on the fact that they're doing that. But like, we were doing that in January 2014. One of the first things I was taught in training is try to figure out consistent lanes so you can put carriers on a routing guide to send them the loads and they can accept or reject them. So from a business infrastructure perspective, I don't think a ton has changed. I think there are more good tech products to enable carrier reps to procure capacity.
Sure.
And when matched with the right TMS platforms, that actually makes a company that's coming out of the gates, getting off the shelf technology more powerful, because you can essentially put a jetpack on a carrier seller, and what they may have been able to do, maybe they could book 8 loads before, maybe now they can book 12 or 14. It's fantastic for efficiency. So I think the tech off the shelf is significantly better, but the concepts are relatively the same. You're on the phone, It's email. You're trying to figure out what carriers run what, where's that information live. There's more access to better tech, but we were doing some of this fundamental tech type stuff in 2014. So I don't think much of it has changed. I think it's easier for other people to get access to it to an extent now.
Yeah, that's for sure. 100%. I think the fundamental approach to carrier sales hasn't changed. It doesn't matter how good your tech is. If you don't prioritize the carrier, you're going to have a tough time getting them to move your freight, take your freight consistently. They may take it once, but they're definitely not coming back. And they're not going to give you access to the same capacity as they gave you before. There are still people, I tell people this all the time, so that people probably get sick of hearing me say this. I still have what you call those black book carriers. I still have carriers that I can call when I need something, and they will give me their truck. They will give me their truck over someone else because they trust me. I trust them. We've known each other. They know that when, they have a truck somewhere and they need help from me, that I'll pay them an extra 50 or 75 bucks or whatever it is, over the market to keep them moving, to be fair to them, whatever. And we all if you've been a carrier sales rep for more than 2 years, you've got that. You have 15 or 20 guys that you can do that with. But as Will said, there's just, when he started, there just was a lot of grunt work that went into getting access to data itself. Right now there's so many different platforms out there that you could at least have a head start where I know, okay, well, this guy's never, they've never had an inspection past, west of the Mississippi. I'm not going to call them on a California load, right? And, those type of things, that information really wasn't around back then. You had to go get that information, store it. Now you could at least, it's directive, and you can import that information. You could put it in front of people. So when they're going out and they have to find something, they're making 10 quality calls instead of 1 quality call out of 10. And it just, if you're not taking advantage of that, you're really kind of falling behind. But yeah, the approach hasn't changed much, but the tech and some of the enablement has.
Going forward, obviously, there's a couple of different companies that at least I've been keeping an eye on, and particularly around the adoption of AI. People have different views on it per se, but I'm just curious what you guys might be thinking and what your thoughts are on what you're seeing. There's obviously these. For example, I think Circle Logistics adopted an AI that allows you to, I believe it allows some negotiation on the carrier side of things. And I don't know to what extent, that changes businesses. I don't know to what extent that it's permanent or whether or not it's supplementary to a business. If it's, how do you guys see that? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people out in the audience that are probably curious as to what, if anything, might change in the business with that new type of technology.
Yeah, I think from the first standpoint is, you have the difference between machine learning and AI, and I think we all use machine learning, and that's just if you're not doing that part of it, then you're already behind. You're way behind. But the AI things, I think you could use it as a supplementary tool. I think if every freight brokerage took a step back and said, of the amount of inbound calls, we don't post a lot of freight. We never really posted a high percentage of freight at Coyote either. But when you do get those inbound calls, 80% of those calls need to be filtered out. Either, it's someone that you're not going to work with. It's something where the price, they're just never going to come close on price, or they don't have a truck. They're just fishing for information and stuff like that. AI is a useful tool to weed some of that stuff out. But the other part of the equation is if you're not using AI to help weed some of those things out, but also you give the information to a human to follow up on, you're not going to rely on AI to build a relationship. That's just, not, I don't think you're ever going to take that human relationship element out of there, but you can definitely use AI to go find the carrier or filter the carrier. And then all of a sudden now you've just, probably filtered 80% of the noise out of, hey, I've got to make 50 outbound calls to try to cover this load. AI can go out there and, figure out how to get a hold of these carriers and figure out which carriers still have trucks and then put those in front of a human, and a human can actually help, build that relationship. Or heck, AI has been pretty successful on the transactional side, but usually when you reach out to a carrier, it's the first time you talk to them, you're probably not going to feel as comfortable doing the entire transaction fully 100% automated. But and I think that they probably don't want that either. But I think it's come, a heck of a long way in the last year and a half that you kind of see some of these companies pop up. It's actually, the technology out there sounds very good. There's not much difference between, like pauses or responses. And, sometimes it's actually more successful in the negotiating process because it takes some of the human, the element out of it. So it's definitely, it's stuff that we're using as a supplementary tool or thinking about using it as a supplementary tool. But I think it's all about just really kind of helping our people be able to do more and spend less time, like a tracking call or something like that. Sometimes it's just like, do you really have to have a whole bunch of humans? I mean, we have 90% of our freight is automated from a tracking perspective, but there's still sometimes we need driver information. We need that ELD number. We need that. That's not really a value add to per se, but I mean, it's something that's an expectation that you're going to have in order to facilitate or ignite the actual, it's the ignition point for automated tracking to start. And so you could kind of use it as a supplementary tool to get that information.
Will, would you see a broker having an AI and a carrier having an AI, and all of a sudden they're just like talking?
It happens.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I think that if you're not exploring what the tech can do from an efficiency perspective, you're going to get left behind. But it is very much so a relationship-driven business. So you have to have people developing long-term relationships. But man, if I can take a rep and just make their calls more targeted and more efficient, I'd be negligent not to at least explore that, because from experience, man, it's a tough job, right? It's a tough job. And if you're not really, really targeted with what you're doing, it makes it even harder to be successful. So I'm all in on it. I'm intrigued to see how they continue to develop.
I think you're using it for part of your training too, right?
Yes.
I mean, you think about how effective that
awesome,
is.
by the way.
Somebody at any point in time can just actually practice making a phone call with having something else, run through some of the different type of scripts and all that. You don't have to take your, most talented people off the floor that are best at doing their jobs and train people. You're having this actual, system where they can access at any time and do it. Man, that's super cool. I was super excited when you made that post. That was pretty cool.
Mark, have you tried it? Have you tried it yet?
Oh yeah. Not his. And I've tried others, but yeah.
I've actually, I guess I didn't try it personally, but Will came over and a couple months ago, and he pulled out his computer and he's like, "Hey, look at this, this thing I'm working on." And he shows it to me, and it was like a director of transportation. I forgot whatever. I mean, it's a fake caller anyway, but I was like, wow, this is incredible. This is not only you couldn't really distinguish it. It even had like some background noise added to the call, so it sounded really realistic. And I was like, this is a great way for anybody to train being on the phone and talking live with somebody.
We have some incredible brokerages using it now to train business development reps. They train their team, and then you need to go demonstrate your understanding. So make a cold call, and we're pumping in the information in the background so they respond the same way you would expect a director of transportation to respond to a cold call or a discovery call or a warm call. But it's the best place to practice, because if you don't actually get your reps in, you're going to get crushed on that first call, and that's no fun. Like, no one enjoys that. So the more repetition you get, the better you can do.
Absolutely.
That's a lot of people. There's a lot of worry that I guess people have around this, but I'm more so on the optimistic side. I think in terms of just amplifying just human efficiency in general. And I think, Mark, you said yourself, like most of the loads, especially at least at Coyote, like they weren't being posted publicly. So like the people had to go out and leverage their relationships, and gave those, many of those loads that were, let's say, let's call them high risk, right? Like the customer was very dependent on good quality service there. You'd leverage your relationships and not kind of just post it out to any random carrier. So back to what you guys were both saying, it's like the relationships, they always will be super vital and critical.
Yeah, the flip side of the equation too is if you post a shipment that you should have called the carrier on or given them access to book it, and then they call in on that and you don't have it anymore, like you just lost, you took a step back in your relationship. I mean, so that's something that you definitely want to try to avoid. And as far as AI, like I don't want a bot calling my relationship carrier. That I can handle whether I'm emailing them or I don't want it. But if you're using it to gather information to try to filter through, is this carrier a viable option for me to use in the future? I could totally see that as being the first phase, and then having a human follow up on that. Like that's to me kind of the logical way that I look at things, but I'm sure everyone has a differentiating opinion, and I don't think anybody's going to be right or wrong about it. I think it's whatever works best for you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Will.
I was going to say, I think about it. I don't know if y'all ever saw that clip back in the day with like Brian Gumbel and Katie Couric. They're like, what is internet? Right. They're like, what are people doing on the internet? It was like early 90s.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now with AI, and it is going to be adopted.
Yeah.
The question is, how are you going to use it to make your team more efficient? And we can't be afraid of it. If you're afraid of it, you're going to get left in the dust. There are different ways to use it, but it will make your business more effective.
I was yesterday at a small conference here, Midwest European Truck Association or something like this, and Pavel Botev, he's building a couple of different truck like software SaaS products here, but in Chicago. But he was advocating a lot for like the adoption and use of AIs, particularly on the carrier side, mainly because a lot of these companies are basically switching around their overseas labor, like their staffing options, and especially as the margins basically keep getting thin and thin, these carriers are looking to switch from maybe staffing in Colombia to staffing in whatever, maybe in Europe, and like the lack of the training being implemented as they're switching across these places is actually overall impacting like their service quality. So he was advocating really a lot for carriers themselves actually adopting some of this AI where he himself, I think at his own trucking company, he's using it for recruiting drivers. So drivers basically call in and they're asking any questions about, what the company does, what type of, pay they have or benefits or whatever. He's found a huge efficiency gain. And it's also a great filter system for him to be able to just clearly identify, know which ones to spend, which potential drivers to be spending time on. So, there's a lot of efficiency, not even just from the brokerage side, but for sure, definitely from the carrier perspective as well. So, what else? What else is there? Mark, I guess real quick, how I know all this natural disaster stuff was happening. How has it been down in Florida after all this?
Yeah, it's been pretty intense. I mean, I can say that it was probably the two most stressful weeks of my life going through those things because, the first one, no one, evacuated because, the thing was 100 miles off the coast. We've been through those before. Those don't usually do anything for us, but, the surge did come through and for me, in and of itself, where my house is situated, we got lucky. The water came about 5 or 6 blocks up to my west. And, I think I showed you videos and photos of I think one of them was actually someone that works for us. I think he had 5 or 6 feet of water in his house. And that's the unfortunate thing is, when you get lucky, a lot of times someone else isn't. But yeah, it's about 125, 150 mile stretch along the west, coast of Florida that if you lived within 1/10 of a mile, you probably took in some sort of water during Helene. And then the second one obviously comes through and we all ran from that one from the most part. And I was up in Georgia, in Alpharetta because I used to live there. So we went somewhere comfortable, for a while until we got our power back and all that kind of stuff. And that was mostly wind damage. And, we all got some of that, nothing huge, at least, in our area. But there were pockets because, I think in some of our areas, it rained between like 11 and 15 inches over, I think it's like a 12-hour period. And so some of these areas that have never historically flooded ever, because they're just nowhere near the coastlines because we took on so much water, and they were more in, I guess, more of a natural bowl type of setting. They got the water this time, and it's interesting because the pockets were all over the place. And but yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, that's the risk you take when you live down here. I mean, when you live up where Will's at, and you've got the frozen tundras and all the the chaotic mess that, and I think you too, Christian.
I'm really close to Will. So as soon as it gets cold over here, I'm already starting to think about Florida. For sure.
I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I lived in Chicago for probably half of my professional career. And so I get it, man. You just go through different changes, right? And I think the good thing for us in general is we have multiple offices that could pick up the slack. We have, we've all been through a whole bunch of this. You've been through COVID, you've been through whatever. So you've got the ability to work remote. And so I think, all of that, is a saving grace when it comes to actually continuing, because that's the crazy part of it is even if you weren't impacted by the hurricane in of itself, like our office never lost power. So we were okay, but just getting to the office, I mean, there were down power lines, there were trees, there were flooding. And so you had to have the ability, and people lost internet, lost power. I mean, my power cut off about 9:00 on Wednesday, and we got it back. I think it was like Saturday night. So, when you're without power, you can't effectively go on living the way that you normally live. Your life is kind of turned upside down. Stuff's closed. People can't go to school, so you just have a whole bunch of, all other stuff that you have to deal with. And, we've been through it, whether it's, the Chicago office is having trouble and we have to pick up the slack here, or, there's something going on somewhere else.
How does this look like after a disaster in terms of like, I don't know if I want to pose it as like the freight market per se, but I mean, there's obviously a rebuild effort that takes place. And what do these natural disasters usually end up having a pretty decent effect overall on the amount of materials, goods, things that need to get moved, obviously down to Florida?
Yeah, for sure. Anywhere. I mean, it's you have the, if you're in with any of the disaster relief companies or those that are associated with it, even secondhand, there's opportunities there. You do have there's some displacement in capacity overall, so you have to rework some things, for a little while. But man, I'm telling you, Florida it's insane how quickly people rebound down here. I mean, it's like. Really? We're not that far off of what happened. We've got everybody back in the office. Businesses are starting to open up. Some people are still dealing with some of, the insurance issues and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. But I mean, the freight network is pretty much back up in normal right now.
Wow, it's pretty fast. Is it usually you see like a surge in I guess materials needing to be delivered like immediately right after, or is it kind of like a rebuild period where maybe some planning needs to take? I guess the planning is seemingly happening pretty fast. So I don't know if people are like rebuilding houses and destroyed property like immediately, or if this is kind of like a prolonged period of time where, materials and people are rebuilding all their stuff, but throughout the weeks, coming months and stuff like that, or is it usually a surge of freight?
It's just the original surge of freight is just to get the people the materials that they could survive with, and then from there you have some of the rebuilding efforts, but you can only rebuild so quickly because you have, there's a limited supply of contractors and stuff like that can get the work done. So I think this one in general, just because typically when a hurricane comes through and it makes landfall, it impacts a smaller geographical area. Whereas Helene just had such a massive impact for so many people. And so I think the full rebound for this one, or full rebuild, is going to take a lot longer. And you just see, I think it's going to be in waves and stages and phases, or whatever you want to call it, from the rebuilding standpoint.
I guess that's one of the benefits of living up here during the winter and during the cold, which maybe we'll take. But cool.
It's 86 degrees down here right now, though, guys. I mean,
that's beautiful.
It's so nice. It is so nice.
Very jealous. All right, guys. thanks both of you for coming on. This was great. I learned a lot, especially from your guys' expertise, and you guys have done some great things. But loved having you on. We'll love to stay in touch with both of you, and hope to have you guys maybe on for another round sometime in the future. But thanks everybody for tuning in. This was Mark Ford and Will Jenkins joining us today. Hope you guys have a good rest of the Friday and rest of the weekend. So see you guys next week. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.